George Washington is well known for being the first president of the United States of America and being the commander of the Continental Army in the American Revolution. But many less people know of his rise to power and his military achievements in the French and Indian War. He played a major role in the French and Indian War and later used this vital experience in warfare during the American Revolution to liberate America from British tyranny. George Washington. How did his involvement in the battle for Fort Duquesne affect the outcome of the French and Indian War? In the year 1732, on the day of February 22nd, a child was born to Mary and Augustine Washington. They named him George. One of his siblings was his elder brother named Lawrence, who would give him assistance later in life. He would guide George toward his first job, working as a surveyor for Lord Fairfax, Lawrence's father-in-law, and also give George the aspiration to join the military. With the help of Lawrence, George would grow up to be one of the most important and influential people of his time. Growing up in a relatively wealthy family provided George with many privileges, such as good education. That education allowed him to get a surveyor's certificate, which he used later to get his first job with Lord Fairfax as a surveyor. George got his first formal job as a surveyor at age 16, mapping the massive grounds owned by the Fairfax family. After 2 years, he quit formal surveying, and in 1754, he received a military appointment for the position of adjutant in Southern Virginia. The position was obtained when Lawrence died of tuberculosis, leaving the position open. George, always aspiring to be more like Lawrence, took the job straight away. George's first assignment as adjutant was to travel into the Ohio River Valley to inform these French soldiers at Fort Le Boeuf that they were trespassing on land claimed by Great Britain. He was to tell them that they were to leave or be forced out of the territory. He was also supposed to gain information on French strengths and intentions. When the French politely refused to leave the site, George Washington returned to Virginia unsuccessful. Later that spring, Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie ordered George Washington to take some 150 colonial soldiers to build a road to Fort Prince George, a trading post that was in the process of being converted into a fort at the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny Rivers for easy access and reinforcement. George's men were to assist the men already on the site constructing the fort. However, before George and his men reached the site, the unfinished fort was attacked and captured by 1,000 French and Indian soldiers, who then constructed a new French fort in its place, Fort Duquesne. George Washington, newly appointed colonel of the newly created Virginia Regiment, was still in the process of building the road when he received the news that Fort Prince George had been destroyed and replaced with Fort Duquesne. He then assumed command of the expedition upon the death of Colonel Joshua Fry. He led his men to Jumonville Glen, where he met and joined up with the Indian leader, Half-King Tannac Harrison. They then encountered a Canadian-French scouting party led by Joseph Colon de Bélier de Jumonville. Washington attacked the scouting party, killing 21 French, including Jumonville, and taking 10 captives. After questioning the remaining French soldiers, whom the Indians then ritually killed, he realized he was outnumbered and outgunned. Knowing reprisal was imminent, Washington and his men retreated to Great Meadows and threw together a hastily built fort dubbed Fort Necessity. Fort Necessity had a small palisade and was surrounded by 4 separate trenches for soldiers to stand in to repel attackers. Unfortunately, George decided not to clear back the surrounding trees, allowing the French soldiers cover from defenders. On the day of the attack, rain had soaked all of the Virginians' gunpowder and filled the trenches with mud, greatly reducing their ability to hold off the French. The French, however, surrounding the fort and dry under surrounding trees, could simply pick off the colonials one by one. As the battle ensued and the number of casualties grew, the colonials grew increasingly desperate for a way out. This way out came in the form of a contract from the French, saying that the British could leave peacefully as long as they signed it. The The contract included agreeing to the assassination of Jumonville and leaving the area for a period of 1 year. After George and his remaining men retreated from the site of Washington's only military surrender, they returned to Virginia. Back in the colonies, however, Britain's policies put George, as a colonel, under the authority of all British soldiers stationed in the nation, and gave him lower pay than British soldiers of the same and even lower rank. Indignant, George resigned in October 1754. However, in 1755, he was contacted by General Edward Braddock. Braddock was leading an expedition to Fort Duquesne with orders to take the fort and further expand British control of the area, and he wanted George to help him. George agreed to become Braddock's aide-de-camp, or a confidential assistant of military rank. Braddock was a veteran soldier, and because he had 1,500 British soldiers and artillery under his command, he decided to expand the road built by Washington in order to adequately supply his forces. After major delays made by the construction of the road, Braddock and his men reached the crossing of the Monongahela River on July 9th. However, before they were able to reach the fort, an ambush made by the French and their Indian allies hampered the British regiment. After 3 hours of fighting and over 900 British casualties, including General Braddock, Washington was able to safely evacuate the remaining soldiers. His heroic actions earned George the title of Hero of the Monongahela and a promotion to colonel, despite the fact that this was the greatest loss by the British in the entire war. By 1757, the war seemed like a lost cause for the British. They were low on funds to be used for the army. That was, until Britain's Secretary of State, William Pitt, decided to go to any means necessary to win the war. Although running up a massive debt, he was able to recruit more men and purchase more goods and weaponry for use against the French. Thanks to the bolstering of men and supplies, another expedition to Fort Duquesne was planned. In the fall of 1758, General John Forbes marched over 6,000 soldiers, including Colonel Washington and their native allies, the Cherokee and Catawba tribes, over Braddock's Road to Fort Duquesne. Upon arrival, General Forbes learned from a French prisoner that only 200 men with low morale and food stores occupied the fort at any given time, and that the walls were thin enough for cannon to be used to punch through them. However, on November 24th, the night before the attack was planned, Forbes learned that the French soldiers stationed there had destroyed and evacuated the fort. The next day, Forbes and his men were able to claim the land where Fort Duquesne once stood, and there they built Fort Pitt in honor of the man who funded the expedition. The French and Indian War came to an end with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The Treaty of Paris gave control of Canada and Florida to Great Britain, while the French gained the Philippines and Guadeloupe and Martinique, which were two rich sugar islands in the Caribbean. But there was still the matter of who would pay for Britain's debt in the war. The king wanted the colonists to pay huge taxes to make up the money, seeing as how he had just spent 70 million euros, which today is about $15.5 billion, to keep the Ohio River Valley from being conquered by the French. The colonists, being denied access to the west of the Appalachians because of the proclamation of 1763, refused to pay the heavy tax and later entered the area anyway, rebelling against British rule. In the years following the war, the colonists felt that the acts imposed on the colonies by British Parliament violated their rights as British subjects, and having no representation in British government, they had no control over taxes or any way to voice their opinions to any effect. These factors led to unrest in the colonies, and factions such as the Sons of Liberty ramped up the already growing fervor against the British government, until events such as the Boston Tea Party and the battles of Lexington and Concord pushed the situation over to the edge, which later led to the Revolutionary War with Britain. The conflict in the French and Indian War were the battles between the French and the British over the Ohio River Valley and over land in North America. These conflicts made Britain the dominant world power concerning things like land and military might. The compromises in the French and Indian War were when the British and the French both gained land that they did not previously own in exchange for peace. Also, there were many other compromises within the war, one being the French allowing George Washington to leave Fort Necessity by signing their contract.